All right, and it's recording. Fantastic. Right, and we have 5 participants. And 8, 10, all right, 12 there. All right, people are coming in. So fantastic. All right. Well, welcome everybody. We are getting ourselves going here in just a minute. So we have our several of our panelists here, and we have the attendees that are coming in. We'll get started here right about 3 o'clock, maybe 3:01, to give folks a second or two to chime in or to log in. And in the meantime, for the attendees, for students and everyone who is a guest, welcome. And we will be, like I said, sort of getting things rolling here in just a couple of minutes. So your mics are muted, and so you will not be able to comment, but everyone who is an attendee should be able to enter questions and comments into the chat section, which the panelists will be able to see. And we have one of our panelists, Dr. Griffin, who will be kind of monitoring that. So if we miss any questions, or hopefully we've got some good aspects. Hey, Adia, how are you? So come on in. You all good?
Hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. All right, fantastic. So we've already kind of officially sort of started, and the aspect we were waiting for you and for our attendees to get in here. So we've got about 25 attendees so far, and we had about 45 pre-registered. So I figured I'd give it an extra minute or two to let everybody log in. I knew a couple people were going to be logging in from their phones if they couldn't be at their offices and various other places. So we'll kind of give everybody a chance to do that. So welcome everybody. Come on in. And see 26. Yep, looking pretty good. All right. Oh, wait, let me remind myself to turn my phone off. Okay, there we go. All right. So got that. And I will go ahead and do this. Ooh, wait, this part here. And I'm going to do my screen share here and kind of our backdrop there. All right. All right, terrific. Is everybody able to, can everybody see that in terms of the screen? Fantastic. All right. So again, welcome. Just a quick note here as we're waiting for everybody to kind of get in here and get started. You won't be able to speak or turn on your cameras for the participants, all of our guests that are here. You just get to sit back and enjoy. So this is, I believe, the 4th time we have had a panel discussion. We would have been 5 in a row, but that lousy pandemic got in the way and ruined our streak halfway through. So this is our 2nd year running where we've had a virtual panel discussion on sexual assault. And y'all are in for a treat because we've got a little extra tonight, or tonight, I keep saying tonight, like I'm a game show host. No, we basically have we're actually going to be talking about stalking as well, which has kind of been in the news a little bit recently. And it's definitely something that I don't know that much about, but our panelists know a lot about. And I'm excited to be able to get to some questions about that as well. So for the panelists who are coming in, please feel free to take your time. Go ahead and type in questions into the chat. And hopefully we'll be able to see that. I don't think I've seen that any questions pop in yet, but if you have any questions along the way, please do type them in. We will be able to get to those. I'm planning on spending at least the last 30 minutes or so, hopefully the last half of the panel discussion, covering questions from our guests. So I really do want to hear from you. As what happens to me whenever I attend events like this, I always have questions that pop into my head as we're going through. So feel free to write them down, type them down as they come to you. And we're going to try to get to as many questions as we possibly can. So I think it's going to be a really good event. I always have a great time, and our time always goes by really, really quickly because it's obviously something that all of us care deeply about, and it's a very important issue. So, all right, so 303, let me see, we got about 40 people, so probably a pretty good number. So yeah, so I'm gonna go ahead and get us started, and I will introduce our panelists. And so we have, and I'm just gonna go from kind of top to, I'm gonna go clockwise on my screen at least. So To starting out, we have Shannon Nix, who is the Associate Director of the Sexual Assault and Violence Intervention and Prevention, also called SAVIP. So one of those fantastic long acronym names over at USC. And so she's been there for, I'm not sure how long you've been over at USC, Shannon, but I know you've been working with us for at least 4 or 5 years since we started.
Yeah, it'll be 7 years, June 1st.
There you go.
Yep.
So time flies, absolutely.
Yep.
She's a wonderful contributor and knows just an incredible amount of wonderful information about of not only just these topics about sexual assault and trauma, but also how it impacts the brain and just numerous different other areas. So she's been a wonderful resource for us. We also have Charlene Mooneyhan, who is new this year. She is a victims advocate over at the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, or SLED. And she is joining us this year, and it's a wonderful new voice to be able to have on the panel. And we are very, very excited to have you, Charlene. So thank you so much for joining us. And then we also have Adia Daniels, and she is the Education and Outreach Manager at what used to be called Sexual Trauma Services of the Midlands, is now called Pathways to Healing. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, good. All right, I want to make sure. I updated a couple slides as well. And so that's a fairly recent change, is it not?
Yes, yes. This past fall was when we did our rebranding.
Okay, so I clearly have not been in the loop with the rebranding. So when I typed in STSM, I'm thinking, it looks like the same web page, but I wasn't 100% sure. So, yes, and we also have, many of y'all can also see Angela Griffin. She is our sort of co-host and will be monitoring the chat and also just helping to make sure people don't have any particular problems, logging in and different things like that. So thank you very much, Angela.
Glad to be here.
All right, terrific. Well, let's see. We've already got one question in the box. And it's from Luann real quick. And this is a really good question, I think, that for Shannon, you want to go ahead and jump in there since we just mentioned SAVIP. So Shannon, would you share about the SASS program?
And I'll be honest, we don't oversee that program and we're not directly involved in it. There is a class that is a self-defense, interpersonal violence specific self-defense course that's semester long. And it's taught by 3 or 4 different instructors, depending on the time of year. We do go into the class depending on the instructor. So Tina Gooding, who used to be here at USCPD and is now at the Criminal Justice Academy, she teaches. And so she has us come in and do our healthy relationships, communication, and consent presentation. But I don't have a lot of really specific information on it simply because we don't oversee that program. But it is like self-defense. And I think they teach some about interpersonal violence as well.
Very cool. All right. Well, awesome. So what we're going to do here to start out is I've got a PowerPoint just to let our guests know a little bit about kind of what this event is and what it's meant to be, and also some different things that we've done in the past and what we're also looking forward to doing in the future. And then we're going to open it up to some questions about sexual assault, stalking, consent, just topics in general that a lot of times college students just need to know about. And a lot of times people just don't have conversations about this. It's been one of the very fun things this semester teaching one of my classes. We've started some awkward conversations. And so just how to have difficult conversations. And they've been topics about mental health and boundaries and relationships. And one of the topics was sex. And so we were just discussing, you never get a chance to discuss this. And so it's a very important topic. So we're going to go ahead and do our presentation. I'm going to get that out of the way. And then at the end of the presentation, by the way, everyone, there'll be a list of resources, including Pathways to Healing, including the SAVIP program, other links. So to, RAIN, for example, there's numerous different organizations. So feel free to have a pen and paper ready or taking a screenshot if you'd like. All right, so I go ahead and get us started here. All right, so it's time to talk. Here's our little title slide. We'll move right on. All right, so each year we designate kind of a week or at least a day. And this week, with the pandemic going on, it's been a little bit more hectic. So last year and this year, we sort of have a week or a day we've put on a series of different events. It's been a little smaller with the pandemic, as I mentioned, but we are focusing on sexual assault. And so with the idea that on college campuses, no matter what the college campus that you're on, whether it's USC, MTC, or anywhere else, honestly, anywhere, sexual assault is an issue that people have to deal with. It's one that people don't ever really think about or like to think about frequently, but it's a real issue and it has a very serious impact on people in an everyday basis. And so we've been doing some events, and some of the events that we've conducted here at MTC have included the Clothesline Project, which I'll talk to you a little bit about in a minute. Some moving screenings. So we've gotten, I'll talk a little bit about what we've done in the past, and also panel discussions like this one. So the first thing is the Clothesline Project. The Clothesline Project, I believe, does Savit still doing one, Shannon?
We opted not to this year. We're doing things like consent karaoke, and we do denim day now every year. So we're doing more along that line. Yep.
Gotcha. So different organizations will put on the Clothesline Project. It started in 1990 as basically just an opportunity to sort of let people know about domestic violence, sexual assault, numerous different types of issues. And essentially people decorate different color t-shirts for different types of issues. We've been able to do that over at airport and Beltline campuses a couple of times pre-pandemic. I'm looking to bring that back next year, which I'm really excited about. And here are just some of the shirts that we've had from past Clothesline projects. So we've been providing the shirts. Sometimes people provide their own shirts. So there's a lot of different ways that you can do it. But we've kind of used the white canvas, the shirts, for people to be able to just put whatever they want. And then they're able to literally hang it up on a clothesline in a prominent place. And the whole idea is to let people to see the t-shirts and to have people think about it, because it's, again, just not something that people actually really think about. And the messages typically are very, very powerful. These are just a few of the, I don't want to say favorites, it's not really the right way of putting it, but some of the more shirts that have really stood out to me that I've included in this visual that everyone can see here. My personal favorite, I will call it that, I guess. It's not an outfit, it's an invitation, or it's an outfit, not an invitation. You know, so that aspect, a lot of times people, that gets into kind of the victim blaming aspect, which is very, very common in sexual assault and domestic violence and things like that. So, so just a really wonderful project that I'm really excited to be able to kind of get started again next year. In addition to that, we've also done movie screenings. So it's been a couple of years. I'm looking forward to getting back into doing this as well. The big crowds thing wasn't really popular the last couple of years. But in 2019, we obtained the rights to The Hunting Ground, which is a documentary about sexual assaults on college campuses, particularly some large college campuses. I believe the setting in the Hunting Ground, some of the main characters or main advocates are from the University of North Carolina. And so it is actually, we have that available at the library. So if you'd like to check that out and take a look at that. It was on Netflix at one point. So I'm not sure if it makes its rounds on Netflix from time to time, but it's really, really good. It's very powerful. It's kind of in your face, which is really it's needed, but it's a very powerful documentary. So I'm looking forward to perhaps being able to do that in kind of perhaps a larger gathering next year as well. And then, of course, we have panel discussions like what we're doing today. So we've had in-person panel discussions. These are the two that were in 2018 and 2019. We had one virtually last year over Zoom. I don't have any pictures of that because it's kind of like a Brady Bunch picture, probably wouldn't look very right. But yeah, so doing panel discussions, and we definitely intend on continuing to do this just because it's a very, very important issue. And so here are some lists of resources for everyone to write down. So we've got counseling services here at Midlands. You've got the telephone numbers and the email. Pathways to Healing, you've got their telephone number there, the 771-7273. The Hive is another community organization that also deals with sexual assault and domestic violence. And so you've got their website and telephone number. USC Savit program. Sorry, it's such a tongue twister. I can't say the whole thing. And then the National Sexual Assault Hotline, or the website RAIN, okay, is another organization that deals with sexual assault, rape, incest theories, things like that. Very good organization, lots of good resources there available. And then you've got the National Domestic Violence and Suicide Prevention Hotline numbers there as well. So I'll leave that up on the screen for a minute for anybody who's maybe jotting down numbers or doing a screenshot. You know, you can feel free to go ahead and take those, take that information down. So that's just basically kind of what this is. And again, this panel discussion is really just designed to allow people to talk about sexual assault, that people who really know about it and deal with it and deal with the outcomes of that and dealing with victims and things like that, and help people to just get more educated about it. So that's basically what we're going to do today. So that took about 10 minutes. That's what I was hoping for. So most of our time can be me not talking, because that's always good when I don't talk. My students know all about that. All right. So let's see, we got, oh, looks like we're up to about 44 participants. So fantastic. So most everybody who signed up is here. That's great. That's great. All right. So I will go ahead and open it up to the floor. And we'll just go ahead and get started off with that wonderful first question. What is sexual assault? Who would like to jump in and dive in and say, and give us a good working definition? Because when people hear that word rape, that's the word that people have historically heard, but the term sexual assault is more broad, and I think is appropriately so. So who would like to kind of jump in there and give us a definition? I'll call on you.
I can go ahead. It's fine. So sexual assault is a really broad term that encompasses many things. It's would include your typical rape, as he stated, but also any unwanted touching, fondling, any advancements in a sexual nature that are unwanted, really. And that can be, it doesn't just include your private parts or your genitalia. You know, it can be any type of touch that is sexual in nature and makes you feel uncomfortable. And y'all please add more, because there's obviously more that I'm leaving out, but it's just a very broad general term.
Okay. Shannon or Adia, would y'all like to add anything?
I think that's a perfect description of what it is. It is, I think of it as an umbrella term that has lots of different types of contact and non-contact, types of violations that would be considered sexual assault. Any sexual interaction where someone has not given consent. It's sometimes a way to think of it. But then, I think a lot of people don't think of like I mentioned, the non-contact forms of sexual assault, forcing someone to pose for pornography, flashing someone, exposure, things like that also would fall underneath that umbrella.
And I think another aspect of the definition, the broadness, includes what sexual assault is also something that some people may not consider sexual assault. That's another interesting aspect when you ask certain people what sexual assault, what crosses that line and actually becomes sexual assault, people will disagree. And that's why that definition is broad, because
Sure.
The victim would very likely interpret it, obviously, as something that's unwanted and unwelcome, and that to them is sexual assault, whereas perhaps the perpetrator might not even think too much about it, if you will. So that's why I think that's a good reason why that has that broader definition. That kind of being going on, we mentioned it being kind of any sexual contact-ish behavior that is unwanted or non-consensual. So what is consent? So Shannon, maybe you want to jump in there with the consent piece.
Right. Well, consent is agreement, right? And consent, I just did a podcast here that we have on campus yesterday talking about it. And I'm like, we learn consent when we're little. You can't just go get food out of the cabinet when you're a kid, right? Like, you have to ask, you have to get permission. So it's literally giving permission. It can be verbal, it can be nonverbal, it can be actions, right? But it's getting that permission from that person explicitly, like that this is okay to do. So that's kind of how we think about it. It's not coerced, right? It's not silence. It's not maybe, but it's that explicit permission. So.
Okay. And so, and the next part of that question was kind of, what does it look like? I think you've sort of answered that as well. So that it's going to be that verbal, it's explicit. It is not.
Yeah,
like
I mean, ideally it is a conversation. We also recognize when people are in relationships, and particularly in long-term relationships, you may have some nonverbal ways that you let folks know, no, that's not okay, or yes, this is what we want to do, right? So just knowing that, and if you're not sure, you ask, like, hey, I'm not sure. Is that what you meant by this? Like the way you looked or whatever you did. So it's always getting that clarification.
Mm-hmm. And that was another interesting aspect of this that I think we've talked about in previous years, is that consent can change.
Yes.
Right. I mean, like during any type of whatever, between a couple, you know, that someone may become uncomfortable with something along the way. And so maybe they said yes, and at some point though, but then they're giving off signals, maybe, you know, trying to create distance or something, and they're just not comfortable anymore. At that point in time, consent is revoked. It's no longer consensual. And so that's another, I guess, I know maybe the right way of putting it is it should be ongoing,
Yes.
you know, with regards to, you know, when people are being intimate and something along those lines. Okay. Anything y'all else want to add?
I think the component too that I recently had a case that came up with is, and it's common with college students, a lot of people, is when you're drinking too much alcohol. So you're not able to give consent if you are in a state of mind, and the person, from a criminal standpoint, the person who is going into whatever sexual activity with you should know that. As an adult, you should know that if someone is had too much alcohol and they can't give consent. So that is also a criminal offense. If you knowingly know that someone is not in their right state of mind, and not able to give consent, then that is against the law too. And that is just, it's not a position where they can give consent, even if you've had sex with them in the past or had any sexual interaction with them in the past. It really doesn't matter, you know, in that state they can't. And that goes along with vulnerable adults or the population that are unable to give consent as well. But just wanted to add that. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's a very good clarification. It's not just that it needs to be ongoing, but it needs to be they need to be able.
Their state of mind. Yeah, exactly.
Be able to provide consent. So it's not like, oh, well, you know, this, you know, we've had a few drinks and something starts and then, you know, the alcohol kicks in, you know, a little bit more and they become less able to give consent. Well, that's a problem. So, okay. What about some statistics maybe of sexual assault? Like how common is it? I know Shannon, you've probably got some numbers for college campuses. You know, Charlene, you probably got statistics for, you know, from the state, and Adia, you probably got the local community aspect of it. What are some statistics of sexual assault, maybe nationwide, locally, all that? Let's hear some. So Adia, go. I'll tab you first.
Just unmuting. Yep. So I'll give a couple of stats that I like to highlight when we're out doing education. Just nationally, I think this is a RAINN number, but every 68 seconds, a person in the U.S. is sexually assaulted, and so that one sometimes, because we always see the 1 in 4, you know, and sometimes that doesn't resonate with people, or people can't really like humanize that sometimes, and so that one kind of helps me to kind of illustrate the frequency of sexual assault in the U.S. Locally, you know, just a couple of them that stick in my mind are for child sexual abuse in particular. You know, we are at about 1 in 8 children in South Carolina has experienced child sexual abuse. And nationally, that rate is like 1 in 10. So we are a little bit more happening a little bit more frequently in our state. And then just kind of thinking about, I think this is a statistic that we got from SLED, but thinking about just the prevalence of you know, that age group. And so the most common age group that we're seeing that are being sexually assaulted is that 10 to 17 age group by far. I mean, it's, you know, that's the most common age group. And having worked on college campuses, that's my background. That number blew me away, because I would have thought that it was 18 to 22, 18 to 24, just because I've just lived in that framework for a long time, but really it's that younger age group that we're seeing locally.
Okay, so say Shannon, you want to jump in next? for college?
Yeah, I think, right. And so, Adia, I'm with you, the one in whatever, I mean, people hear that a lot, and I don't know, and I'm also the type, I'm like, this stuff is happening. So numbers sometimes don't always translate, or we can kind of be like, okay. I think a couple, like a group, we always have to keep in mind that these things are happening at higher rates with marginalized populations. So like our LGB and trans students are having this occur more often, or victimized more often than our non-LGBT and non-trans students, especially like our non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid folks. Also, there was a study done about males in college. I don't know if you've, Adia or Charlene, you've seen this stat, but it showed that males, I think it was the 18 to 24, because that's the age range they always look at, right? Or 18 to 22. Males in college in that age range were 5 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than males not in college in the same age range. So that's also one that we often highlight, to be like, so many times people are like, it's, I think there's still this perception it's a women's problem. I'm like, it's every single human's problem, and preventing it, right, and speaking out against it, but it's happening. It's certainly happening, we know, disproportionately in marginalized populations, but also, just to point out, it is also happening to men too, so.
And men it's very underreported. We know that kind of generically and historically speaking.
Our
but
society's not set up for really anybody to report. But yeah, males and, again, marginalized folks in particular are not in a great place either to report, so.
Yeah. And just to take, so Adia, you said every 68 seconds. So that, to put something in perspective for everybody who's watching, during the course of this, that means approximately 80 to 90 people will be sexually assaulted while we're here talking about sexual assault. So that's a horrifying thought, but that's just the reality of the situation. And those are the numbers that we do have. Again, number, versus we don't really know necessarily what's going on, going on in different aspects and things like that. So, so horrifying, but again, something that is enlightening, and that's why we're here. So, and then Charlene, maybe, I don't know if you could maybe highlight or add the kind of statewide, or
I didn't pull our statewide stats, and I apologize for that. I do manage our database, but I mean, honestly, it's just, when you see it, I think Shannon kind of hit on this, when you're seeing it. And so it's the stats sometimes, it's just real easy to push numbers off, but when you're seeing it every day, I mean, it's overwhelming. It truly is. So many sexual assault victims, and from people from all walks of life. It's you tend to think, I think people have a mindset also of strangers, and it's so often not that the case. It's most commonly people that or family members, often obviously with our children. I pulled a few stats that I found to be really interesting, that kind of stood out with me. Only 28% of victims report their sexual assault to the police. I'm surprised that number is even as high as it is. That's just this one stat I found.
I was about to say that I'm shocked.
Yeah, that's
like 10 to 20.
You're right. It's a very low number, and it's even lower in certain populations, obviously, kind of like what Shannon was saying. But and then another thing I found that is really not surprising, but really upsetting, is among developmentally disabled adults, up to 83% of females in their lifetime are a victim of sexual assault. It said for males, 32%, but 83. I mean, that's incredibly high and upsetting. My lieutenant that supervises me also supervises all of our state-run facilities for disabled adults. And so I hear the agents all the time talking about the cases they get, and it's a lot of times staff members or other people in the facilities with them, but it's incredibly upsetting, and just something people don't think about as often,
Yeah, and it really is that you bring up a couple of really, really good points. One of which being the aspect of the most likely person to be a perpetrator of sexual assault or molestation with a child is a relative. It is a close friend or relative, particularly with children. It's my understanding, like a second was it a second generation relative, or not a generation, second degree relative, sorry, second. So it's like parents typically don't assault children. That's not as, it happens, but it's not as common. But grandparents, uncles, like stuff like that, that's where you see that. And you don't think about that because children, hey, it's, I got to go to work, little Bobby's got, a cold, can you watch? People don't think about it, but those are the most likely individuals. And I've worked with clients, I'm sure everyone else has as well, where it's been a family member. And of course, the level of horrible trauma that goes along with that is, it's really, that's one thing that I think you bring up that other good point, Charlene, of when you read numbers and you go to an event like this, it's very easy to do that, and we can put up t-shirts on the screen, but when you hear victims and you see them and you see what their lives go through and the horribleness of what it does, it kind of changes how you view pretty much everything revolving around that topic. And so just as with anybody here, if you've ever, those individuals who have been exposed to, it's one thing to talk to someone about the loss of a loved one. And then when you go through it, it's a totally different experience. Same thing when you work with victims and see it, it hits home in a lot of different ways. And so, it's a lot there. Well, that's going to get us into our next question, which is obviously all related together, but this is a new one. We haven't really talked about this. And so I know Shannon was excited about this. I'm going to go ahead and throw this one over to you. So what is stalking and how do we define that? And what is intimate partner violence? Are they different? So let's see if we can get a definition for that one.
Sure, and I'm sure Charlene can jump into with some of the more law stuff, because with stalking, it's really causing, it's a pattern of behavior that causes someone to fear for their own life and safety, or the safety of someone else, and it's repeated, constant, unwanted, unwarranted attention. Again, and the fear piece is really important, because we talk about stalking and harassment, and I'm like, harassment is repeated, but it can just be irritating. Like, please, like one of our staff had a client this morning and she's like, it's more harassment. And it's like, so it's kind of more like, just please leave me alone. Like, I'm not afraid of you, just please stop texting me. Versus stalking is like, there's fear, truly. And it's part often of abusive relationships, which is just really, abusive relationships is where one partner uses methods and tactics to maintain power and control over the other. Stalking is part of that. Harassment's part of that. I could do a whole day training because that's kind of one of my favorite things to train on. So I'm really glad that you included it, because particularly on college campuses, we focus a lot on the sexual assault piece when you think about Title IX, but Title IX prohibits these things too. You can have a Title IX hearing for a relationship, for dating violence, domestic violence, and stalking. So I think these things are important to be aware of too.
Okay. What about intimate partner violence? What's the difference between, so stalking is this repeated pattern or behavior that's causing someone to be afraid. What would it be? How is that different than intimate partner violence?
So that's that piece where someone is maintaining power and control, and they do it like, we talk about here 5 different types of abuse: physical, psychological, which is the most common and you see in every single abusive relationship ever, financial, technological, and sexual. So you have these types of abuse, and these are ways that folks maintain power and control. And stalking is often part of that too, and it often starts actually during the relationship, not just after. So much like sexual assault, the majority of people who are stalked by someone they know and have likely been in a relationship with, whether it was more casual or more serious. We do occasionally, rarely get like the stranger stalker, or I have no idea who is doing this, but those may be once a semester or once an academic year, versus we see much more of the stalking and harassment by ex-partners usually, or people like they've been in kind of a dating relationship with.
Okay. So Charlene and Dia, you want to add to that? No? Okay, that's okay.
I'd be happy to. I'd be happy
sure,
to.
go ahead. I want to get as like different.
Yeah.
That's why we have.
Sure, we all have different expertises and different backgrounds to share. Yeah, I think she definitely defined it accurately, and it's all about power control for the intimate partner violence all day long. I mean, that's what it comes back to, and when you're in a situation like that, if you don't come from a background where you've studied it, I don't think victims even understand that. And that is a whole nother day, like she said. I mean, that is even teaching the victim and kind of retraining their brain. I mean, I remember I had a victim, and I will never forget this. She said to me after, I don't even remember how far out after this was. It was a couple months. She had been in therapy for a few months. She definitely wasn't out of the woods yet, but she was in a better place. She was on her own. She was in housing on her own. The perpetrator was in jail. And I remember she said to me, the other day, I realized that I decided where I put my salt and pepper shakers for the first time. So she had been controlled to the point where she could not even decide where she kept her salt and pepper shakers, or she would be in trouble and physically, but mostly psychologically abused because of putting them in the wrong place. I mean, just think about that. Like it's so hard for people that have never been through that or witnessed it or been a part of a family, that it's hard to even imagine, but slowly they build up to that level of control. So I just wanted to kind of share that story.
Wow. That's something you said there towards the end. Is that something that you commonly see? Like it starts with like small little bits of control and then begins.
We all, yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
Okay.
I think kind of like Shannon hit on earlier, I think she did. Technology is making it so much worse, and that plays into stalking as well, because like she said, it starts with relationship. It starts during the relationship with stalking oftentimes, and technology makes it so much worse because they put trackers or they demand that they know their passcodes, and if they don't, then they're just going to make their life horrible. So it certainly makes it much worse for these victims. And then of course, being able to watch their moves on social media and things like that play into it and make things so much worse. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's one thing I guess since I haven't dealt with stalking myself as much, I wouldn't have thought about it. Something that starts small in a relationship, like, oh, well, I really, I just want to know where you are to make sure you're safe, type of thing. I'm sure it could start that way, and then very, very quickly.
Exactly it. Yep. I care about you. I want to know where you are throughout the day because I care about you. Yeah, that's exactly how it starts.
I want to know where you are so I can surprise you.
Yeah.
Hours. Yeah, I can imagine nonsense like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. Cool. Not cool, but good information. That, like I said, that's what I loved about doing this. I learned something every time, and I'm already learning a bunch. So our next question. So what are some myths or common misconceptions about sexual assault? Let's break some of the lousy myths. We've already kind of covered one, like it's always the person hiding in the alleyway with a ski mask on, type of thing, versus the person who's holding your hand while you're walking down the street, type of thing. So we've kind of talked about it's usually somebody very, very frequently. What are maybe some other common myths? So Adia, how about some ones that you maybe have been exposed to?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a few that have come to mind. So I think one is just thinking about the someone's response to being sexually assaulted, and so we think about someone feeling or appearing to be super tearful and just all of the things that we would assume someone may feel after a sexual assault. Within our agency, we do hospital accompaniment for survivors who go to the hospital for a forensic medical exam. And so a lot of times we are seeing them right after it's happened. And one thing that we train our advocates on is just, is just not assuming what that person is going to be acting like. And so we might have someone who's just silent and won't say a word, or someone may be super chatty. Someone may be giggly. It runs the gamut. And I think understanding that everyone responds to trauma in different ways. And then I think it's a myth that there is a normal reaction or a normal response to sexual assault. I'll just do one more because I have a list of myths in my head. I think one big one is, and so primary prevention education is my wheelhouse. And so I think that one big myth is that potential victims can, or people can prevent themselves from being sexually assaulted, right? And so I think it's a myth that if we don't walk in dark alleys, or we, don't use the buddy system, or excuse me, if we use the buddy system and watch our drinks, I think it's a myth that that we can prevent sexual assault from happening to us. Those are, I tell people all the time, those things it's not bad to do. It's not bad to watch your drink. But that's not the thing that stops sexual violence from happening. There's, the perpetrators, the people that do it, right, are the ones that can stop doing it. So I think that's a big one, and making sure that we are putting the responsibility on everyone to prevent this from happening.
Okay, so there's a bunch more. So how about, I know probably those are just some 3 good ones right there off the top. So Charlene, anything that you can think of with like 1 or 2 more that you'd like to add?
I can think of one off the top of my head that I handle all of our human trafficking cases at SLED. So I work with victims who oftentimes trafficking victims are sex workers, and that is their lifestyle, sometimes by choice, sometimes by not. But I think it's a myth that sex workers can't be sexually assaulted. I see that often, and it's a problem I have to work with my agents or investigators that we work with. The agents I work with in the human trafficking team, of course, know this, but there are plenty of police officers out there who might have that, whether it's an internal bias or not, or they don't realize it's something that a lot, I think the public doesn't realize. So just like we talked about with consent earlier, a sex worker, that can be many things. They can give consent for one type of sex, and then they are oftentimes physically assaulted because in other ways, physically or sexually assaulted in other ways, because the perpetrator in those circumstances think, well, she's not going to call the police because she's out here turning tricks and I can get away with this. So if she just agrees to oral sex and he forces anal or any other type of sex, they oftentimes do get away with it. And I've had many sex workers tell me experiences that are pretty awful that they did not consent to, but they were too afraid to report it because, in their mind, they were committing illegal acts to begin with. So that's just a sad scenario that comes to mind.
Yeah. And that's, people don't oftentimes think about individuals who are being trafficked or sex workers as individuals who would be the victim, but those are and would be included in that group, the huge group of marginalized individuals who there's some type of I don't know, we oftentimes in higher education we talk about removing barriers for students, but removing barriers for victims as well. It's like there are so many different barriers that are there, and that's just one. It's like, okay, well, this happened, but if you go report it, well, would that person be arrested for something else that they were doing? They were like, well, that's a wonderful question. So they risk that. So how do you handle that? You mentioned before, like people who have disabilities. I even know, and I've got friends that work overseas and do missions work, and it's that's the same thing. It's frequent victims of sexual assault because they're the perfect victims. They're the people that they work with are deaf, and in certain cultures there's no sign language. It's like, okay, well, they can't talk, they can't communicate. Perfect victims. They don't have the ability literally to speak up and communicate what's going on. And so that those types of issues are enormous problems. Absolutely. So Shannon, I know you've got like about 40 or 50 more probably that you can think of off the top of your head. So
I think the one I'll say kind of goes back to one of the statistics I shared that, and this is a question we often ask like in interviews, and I get stuff sometimes I'm like, oh, that was good. Think about that. But is that men can't be sexually assaulted? I really think that's still, particularly when you look at like hegemonic and really rigid masculinity. and what group maybe that person, again, I work on higher education, so there are student orgs and groups and things like that, particularly depending on what group they belong to, like that can't happen to me. I mean, we still see fairly low reporting, right, with men. So I think that's one that's still around and prevalent.
Absolutely. And there's tons more, but Adia, you mentioned, like it's the girl's fault, type thing. It's the victim's fault. You shouldn't have been there. You shouldn't have been, that's one of the things from the hunting ground. I was like, there's like a higher up, like VP, at like major college, and like, well, what did you do to lead the person on? I'm like, what? Hang on a minute. But no, that's one of the reasons about that shirt. Like, it's a dress, not an invitation type of thing. Yeah, that type of thing. Yeah, it bugs me. All right. Let's see. So, well, we already kind of answered that question. So, what are some of the different barriers that different populations face? We talked a little bit about that one already. How about we kind of get into the next one? How do you talk about sexual assault as a victim or an advocate? Where is a good place to start? So, I'll let Adia go ahead and let you jump on that one, since I don't know, maybe I shouldn't have done it. I don't know. You kind of had that reaction. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking, I was like, how do I answer that one? So, my answer is it depends on the audience, depends on who you're talking to. I typically start talking about sexual assault by having conversations about consent. And again, we talked in detail about that, how it's an ongoing conversation. And I think that's a good starting point, because again, I like how Shannon mentioned, it's not a concept that's unique to sex. I mean, it's asking for permission. It's respecting people's boundaries. And so I from my perspective, I think that's a good place to start.
Okay. So Charlene, Shannon, you want to add, in terms of, maybe how about as like a victim? We kind of talked a little bit about that's like, the different aspect, maybe from a victim standpoint, how would you attempt to talk about that? Or maybe if someone maybe tells you that they have been a victim of sexual assault, like, what do you do with that? Because that's a big thing, just someone being able to talk, and if they feel comfortable expressing that to you and feeling comfortable to even let you know that it happened, what do you do with that? A lot of people would not have any idea what to do with that.
Yeah, because our society isn't great with these things, and there's no manual on it, right? Unless you work in one of our probably offices. There's some manual or training for it. So I know our philosophy here at SAVIP is we don't need details. And I do a lot of training. I do a trauma workshop with a psychologist here on campus. And from that, I also do how to support a survivor, so for students and then for faculty and staff. And so, I say my spiel is, you can tell me as much or as little as you want, but I don't need details. And some people can't even name that that's what it is. Some people aren't ready to put it in those words. I've certainly had students come for me to tell them. And I'm like, like, you define what happened to me. I'm like, no. This didn't happen to me. This happened to you. Sure, what I'm hearing, I would put it in this box, and you get to determine how you want to, like, what box or how you want to conceptualize it until you're ready to put it in that box. Because I was a trauma therapist before too. I do private practice work. And so I'm just like, that's my therapist brain. And I know you get that, right? Like, it's like you get to decide. So for us, it's not about getting details. It's about, let's make sure you know your rights, your options, all the resources that are here for you. And there was something else that just literally left my head, but it's been a week. I'm really glad tomorrow's Friday. But it's just making sure that they're safe, that they have what they need. Our big things are counseling and medical follow-up. I'm like, as long as you've got those two, if you need, and if you're ready, then we're good with that. But we don't need you to dig into it or try to talk through it or tell us the whole story, because we're not the investigator. We're not Title IX. We just want to make sure you're safe. And then if people have questions, we would just, answer them as best we can, or just let them take what we give them and go. And then maybe they'll come back and maybe share a little bit more or not, and just get what they need. So, yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so in terms of what was kind of the next part of that? So you had an idea and it left your brain, and I had an idea. I had a follow up and it left my brain.
I thought of my idea.
Oh,
Sorry,
go.
it's not
Maybe-
an
maybe
idea.
you don't
It's like,
trigger
it's
mine.
like what I trained.
for it.
My thought came to me. The big two things I tell people, I'm like, there's a lot to supporting folks, but if you can listen to understand and not respond, and that means lock your computer, turn off your phone. And then if you can validate, and validate simply means honoring someone's reality. Doesn't mean you have to agree. I always use the example, that friend who was dating that person you didn't like, and then they broke up, and you want to go celebrate or tell your friend how much you hated them. And that's not helpful because your friend's grieving. So validation there would be, breakups are hard. It really sucks to lose someone you love. So if you can just validate, I say to students all the time, like, I tend to use casual language and I curse. So I'll be like, that was a shitty thing that happened to you. This really sucks that this happened. I can't imagine how you're feeling right now. So really, if you can listen and validate, usually you're pretty golden. Like, people don't need much more than that. They don't need advice. They don't want it fixed. It's just, yeah.
Okay. So Charlie, you want to add anything to that?
I was going to say exactly what Shannon just came back with is listen, support, tell them that you believe them, let them know that you're there for them, and know that disclosure is a process, whether you are just a friend or you are the investigator or whoever on the case, involved with that person. It's a process. It's a process. Disclosure is a process, and it's up to them how they want to do that. If it's a little bit at a time, if it's everything at once and they don't stop talking. I think Adia said that earlier. Some victims, all sorts of different, you can't just, there's no one type of response to trauma, and it comes in all different shapes and sizes. So you just kind of go with what they need, whatever that victim, whoever that victim and however they are at that time, but just let them know that they're believed. I think that's really important.
Very good idea. Okay. Well, we're gonna get piggyback. Oh, sorry, Adia, go ahead. No, go ahead.
It's okay. I just want to add one more thing to that. And I think that, just the idea of allowing that person to regain some of that power and control. And so empowering them to make decisions and to do what they feel is right at that time. I think it's sometimes natural to have a tendency to, go to the police, right now. And because we, want, kind of have a way of thinking of what should happen. But just keeping in mind that what they've just been through has been, an extreme violation of so many different aspects of their life, and lots of power and control has been taken away from them already. And so just kind of making sure that we're empowering them to be able to make decisions on their own with your support.
I think that's another really good point as well. So very, very good points. And so Shannon kind of hinted a little bit at it, and we're going to come back to that in just a couple of minutes. Kind of a little bit about the brain stuff, because I'm kind of a nerd with the brain type thing. So I love to talk about trauma in the brain and stuff. So we'll come back to that in a minute. I'm going to kind of continue this line in just a second. But one thing I have noticed, no one's typed in any questions, y'all. So we got like 50 people here. Y'all, I know y'all have questions, so please start typing questions in, because while we have a handful more, we do have about 40 minutes left. So we're a little over halfway done. But I want to make sure we can get to y'all's questions. And so please start typing in questions. So we can have some prepared whenever we get to kind of the end. We may take a little bit more. I don't want to hopefully do any more than maybe 10 or 15 more minutes more with my prepared questions. I want to hopefully leave as much time as we can for our guests and their questions. So as y'all are doing this, I am kind of doing what I do to my students and kind of compelling them a little bit. So I'll go ahead and do that again. So just please type in your questions because I know y'all got them because I always have questions. So feel free to go ahead and start doing that as we are continuing. So we just talked about like, how do you talk about it? Where do you start? What if you were a victim? So what are some basic tactics in terms of managing emotions? We talked about how you can have, there's a bajillion different reactions. There's no set person's going to be this way or that way. So, and the emotions, of course, are going to be just everywhere. Okay. And, like all types of emotions everywhere. So what are maybe, if someone has been a victim, what is something that maybe some advice that you might provide or give, or some basic things in terms of dealing with sexual assault? And I'm going to open that up, whoever wants to jump in.
I can start. I know we do, again, I'm also the trauma and brain nerd too, Drew, but we like to teach some grounding techniques, just really simple things to clients, whether we get a call on the crisis line, or they're here in the office with us, or we're in the ER, because we do that forensic exam accompaniment too, but things to help get people centered and in the here and now. And this is good for all of us, because so often we're either thinking ahead or we're 2-3 days back or months back. So anything that can involve your senses, so as many senses as possible. When we teach is describe an object. So pick up an object and describe it using as many senses as you can. Like, how does it look? How does it feel? How does it smell? Don't lick your phone. Like, or if it's your phone, like I said, tell people don't lick things. Like, maybe if it's your water bottle, take a drink. But what does it sound like? So using as many senses, because you're activating different areas of your brain. And the more you can bring your whole brain on board, the more you can kind of get back centered. Because when that trauma response kicks off, most of your brain is like offline. Things like shades of a color, the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 5 things you can see, 4 things you can feel, 3 things you can hear, I think 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste, right? So things like that, those grounding techniques are some of the things that we do that are really helpful.
Cool. That'll give us a good segue into the brain stuff in a minute. So cool. So Charlene, Adia, what would y'all like to add? Like, what are some basic tactics you either have taught victims or would recommend if someone is maybe a victim of being of sexual assault?
I think, I don't know that it's a tactic, but I think just from a larger perspective, just recognizing and acknowledging that trauma is not linear, and it's healing takes time, and so if I had to turn that into a tactic, kind of giving yourself grace, when it feels like, oh my gosh, I was fine for 5 days, and then that triggered, and now I'm so it's a process that takes time, and it doesn't look like everybody else's trauma, and it doesn't go in a straight line. And so I think those are a few things that I would offer up.
Okay. Charlene, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm to piggyback off of Adia. It's kind of the same thing. When I meet with victims after a traumatic event, it's really just validating their feelings, because I mean, you don't want to tell them, well, how they should be feeling, obviously, how they should be acting, because as we've said many times, trauma comes in all different shapes and sizes for different people. It's all over the map, like Adia just said. So just validating and reminding them to take one day at a time, because I think Shannon hit on that too, is when someone goes through an event like this, they're oftentimes, a lot of victims I work with, I think the same way. They are thinking 1,000 miles a minute about, well, what comes next, what's next month, and that's normal. And that's part of almost Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is you need to know what comes next, because your life has just been turned upside down. So from my perspective, helping prepare them for the next steps in the criminal justice system, or, just in that aspect gives them back a little bit of a feeling of control over their life and knowing what's to come. So I think that the more you kind of explain to them that they feel a little bit better in that aspect. But really just in a support system, I always try to identify if they have a support system. I think that's so important. In how victims come through trauma is if they do have a support network, and just hoping that they are there for them and they can rely on that. Obviously, I refer my victims to counseling. I really, really try and encourage them to go, because I do think that is really critical in helping them kind of, build their life back. But yeah, just supporting them.
Okay. And so with regards to the, oh gosh, I had that thought, lousy thought, just went ahead and floated away on me. I hope it'll come back to me. Shannon, you were good. Yours came back. Hopefully mine comes back. Oh, precious, what was going to ask? I can't remember. Well, let me just go ahead and jump into the next one, because we just talked about like what might you do in terms of, like advice for a victim. How do you report sexual assault? That's going to look probably a little different depending on where you are. So if a college campus, or, you're not a college student or whatever. So maybe we can talk to that. Like, how do you report it? If, and the next question I had was like, what can you do if you feel like you're being stalked? Maybe we can answer kind of both of them at the same time. So the kind of like, what if maybe you feel like you've been sexually assaulted, or you feel like you're being stalked? How do you deal with that in terms of reporting it? So Charlene, I'm gonna let you jump in there, because you got the SLED background.
Okay, so I'll speak from a criminal standpoint. Obviously, colleges, campuses do handle things differently, and every college campus handles things differently too. I've definitely learned that. So, but I think wherever you are, regardless of where you are, if you feel ready to report a sexual assault, you can. Also know that in the state of South Carolina, at least, if you decide to go to the hospital for a sexual assault exam, you do not have to report that to law enforcement. You can remain anonymous, and they will hold that test kit for, I believe it's a year. Tell me if I'm wrong in my mind, but a year. And then if you decide within that time to come forward, SLED will hold on to that, and then you can come forward and still report it. But I think the sooner you report sexual assault and stalking is better, from a criminal standpoint. But obviously your mental state comes first, and you have to do what's best for you. And when you do, I think the process, once you report, you would go to the hospital if you're within that time frame for a sexual assault exam. They have increased it. I believe it's 72 hours now. Once again, I'm so bad with numbers. Am I wrong? I don't know.
96.
96. Okay, it was 72 and now it's 96. So, if you're within that time frame, you'll have a sexual assault exam done, and there will be a support person with you, an advocate. I attend whenever I'm called to the scene, and then oftentimes other agencies have advocates that will be there as well to kind of support you through that process. And then just law enforcement, they ask you every question there is to ask almost during a sexual assault exam too, but law enforcement unfortunately has to ask questions as well. So there's usually at least those two interviews. And for our child victims, sexual assault victims, we refer them to our partner child advocacy centers across the state. So they're interviewed there in hopes that there's not continuous interviews throughout. And so the prosecution can review that interview as well as law enforcement. So that's just a very brief overview, but from my standpoint, but I know Shannon will have more to add from college campuses.
Yeah, no, thanks. I can talk about with us. For us, we are kind of like your on-campus pathways plus sister care, since we do sexual assault and intimate partner violence and stalking and harassment. So for here, if you're at USC, you can just come to us. And part of our job as advocates is to be like, here are your options. Like Adia talked about empowering folks. So if the only thing there's a timeline on is the 96 hours. If you, and it really depends on who's done the harm, whether you can report to the university and have some, attempt resolution that way, or you have to utilize just law enforcement. So if it's a student, faculty, or staff member who's at this university who's done the harm, you can report to our Title IX office. It's an Office of Civil Rights and Title IX. and you can have it investigated that way. And there's some different resolution options. If it's a student, faculty, or staff member at another school, you can report to their Title IX. So if they're at UNC or Clemson or anywhere, you can actually report. We help students report to Title IX offices at other schools when they've needed to do that, and try to get resolution that way. You can also report to Title IX and law enforcement at the same time. So you can do criminal justice and Title IX concurrently. And yeah, I know you know Title IX stuff too. So, so for us, we would just walk you through, like, here are your options. We have police over here fairly frequently because we will call, oh, I'll answer that. I saw someone ask, what is Title IX? So I'll answer that. But we will call and have police come to our office and take reports. CPD can come, USCPD, whomever it may be. We can't attend investigator interviews, but we can go hang out in the lobby or just be available in our office if students or folks want to drop by. Title IX is a federal statute now. It's federal law. It was enacted originally in 1972 to create equity for female college athletes, and it's expanded over the years. It basically prohibits and prevents discrimination on the basis of sex and gender. It's expanded over the years to include forms of interpersonal violence as sex discrimination. So any institution that receives federal funds has to abide by Title IX. And with the Trump administration, it was made federal law. It was guidance beforehand. And so basically schools that receive have to try to prevent these types of things from occurring, any type of sex-based discrimination, including IPV. And then if they do occur, they have to investigate and try to offer some type of resolution. So that's what that is. So that's where you can have that judicial process occur on campus. We also can do no contact orders through student conduct. If it's another student who's doing the harassing or has assaulted someone, they can at least do that. Even if they don't want to do any other formal type of resolution, they can get a no contact order. And a lot of our clients kind of start with that. They're like, well, let me try that. And if that works, like with stalking, if they leave me alone, if the school has told them not to do this, then maybe that's all I need to do. And then if they violate it or continue to violate it, okay, then we can look at restraining order. Then we can look at reporting to law enforcement, that kind of stuff. I think I answered everything.
Okay. We've got some really good questions that people are starting to add in there. And I want to get to those just a minute. I did want to, we didn't quite get to the, maybe like, what do you do if you're feeling you're being stalked? I don't think we necessarily addressed that. When you mentioned it like a little bit, like with the college campus, like maybe getting the campus involved, Shannon?
I mean, I think with that, like report, you know, and when I say report, I include us, the confidential folks, because it may be, this is scary, but I'm not quite sure. The police are also scary, right? If you've never utilized them or had bad experiences in the past, or just are like, that's a scary thing to think about. You can always come to or go to like your confidential folks first. So that may be your counseling center. But if there's a Save Up type office, you've also got like whatever your local nonprofit is. I know the Hive and Sister Care really focus on the intimate partner violence and stalking piece. You can also call them up and they can walk you through. There's the National Domestic Violence Hotline, like there's national resources. See, the Stalking Resource Center at SPARC, SPARC, that's a great resource. So you can kind of look at some of that, but like if you're at USC, you come to us and we would just be like, here's what's happening, here's how to document it, you know, here's your contact log, here are the things to do, and here are all of your options. And we would just, you know, kind of make a plan to check in and see how they want to follow up.
Yeah. And one of our professors, Luann, mentioned like documenting everything, like documentation, particularly I would imagine from a reporting and legal standpoint, the documentation piece is just is very, very critical. And of course, when you've been the victim of stalking or sexual assault, the last thing you're thinking of, oh yeah, let me get those phone records. You know, like you're not thinking rationally. You're not like your brain has just been overwhelmed by all the different aspects of that. And that's unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to talk too much about the brain a little bit. Hopefully we can answer that a little bit more as we go through. I do want to make sure that we get to some of the questions because some of the questions are pretty intense. And so I want to make sure we can kind of get to those. So one person has asked in the chat. I'm going to do the chat and then I'll do the Q&A. So I didn't actually realize that people could do them in both places, but somebody was saying, you know, how do we support someone when the justice system failed them, I guess, in regards to that. So how, I guess, I don't know, Charlene, if you want to.
I would be happy to hop on with that, because from the beginning of the investigation, as soon as I get a case, usually the first time I meet with a victim, unfortunately, I have to start the groundwork from there, because our criminal cases have to be proved at 99%, likely or more that it happened. So that's what the system is. That is a very, very hard threshold to meet, unfortunately. And it's very upsetting for us in the system too. I can promise you, myself as the advocate, the agents who are investigating, or police officers that are investigating these cases, sometimes we have the solicitor decides to take up charges on the investigation. Sometimes they don't, and that can be really upsetting whenever an agent has done everything in the case and the victim has been cooperative, and all those stars align, and sometimes it just doesn't happen. Or sometimes we get to the charges are made, and sometimes whether it's a jury trial, however it's handled, sometimes unfortunately the case just is not. So I start from the beginning telling my victims, do not base your mental health, your well-being off of what happens with the criminal justice process. Just don't, and I start that from day one. And I try to be as honest with them as I can, that it re-victimizes you. It's a very stressful process. It's hard. Honestly, it's harder sometimes for the victims to go through the criminal justice process than the assault itself, or it's just as bad. And I've had victims say that to me. And even if we do everything we can, it just unfortunately, perpetrators have more rights than victims in our system. So it's upsetting to see, but just try to help them channel their energy into better, healing themselves instead of focusing on the outcome of the criminal justice process. Yeah.
That's I have heard that as well from several. I think all of our victims advocates folks we've had on here. It's like it's the from the having to rehash it immediately afterwards when your brain's not even ready for it, to the what feels like a secondary assault to go through the rape kit thing and the hospital like that, and like that. I mean, the people who do it, I'm sure are being as gentle as they can, but you're still doing something that is invasive in and of itself. And then that process of you don't know, and there's no guarantee that you go through all that and get a result where you get the justice that you're looking for. So yeah, so that, and that's some of the we are getting some really good questions, and unfortunately sometimes y'all, I think Charlene, you made a pretty good point. Like the perpetrators kind of have better standing. It's a little bit, and there's things could be better. Things can always be better, but this is an area, again, when that's the downside, and when the benefit, it's one of the benefits of having an event like this, and why you have events to do this, is because like it's a serious issue and no one thinks that it's going to happen to them. And then if and when it does, because we talked about it does, obviously, you put in that situation, and it's just a horrible situation on out of about 8 bajillion levels. And so it's just some of the answers that we're going to be given y'all as the attendees are just probably not going to be what you want to hear. And I wish that was about as well. I think you could have stated that, Charlene, as you could have, but I mean, like, even from the get-go, sometimes you have to say, it's like, okay, this may not end up with, the result that you want, and it's going to be difficult. So so another person, so what do you do when you are ignored when you go to the emergency room hospital after sexual assault? So what do you do if you were ignored when you go to the ER after you've been assaulted? I don't know who to tab on that one.
Well, so that should not happen.
Yeah.
If you're reporting that I will say just recently have we worked on having more hospitals have sexual assault nurses. I cover a lot of areas in the state that are very rural, and sometimes I've had crime victims go to the hospital that we've gone to the hospital and they don't have sexual assault nurses available. So I'm not sure if that's what they're meaning. And unfortunately, we've had to drive an hour away to a hospital that does have a sexual assault nurse examiner available. And that might be what they mean. I'm hoping that's still not a good case, but I'm hoping it should never be you should never be ignored, except, and that you shouldn't be ignored. You should be told what hospital you should go to. South Carolina Victim Assistance Network, SEVAN, has just worked. They've hired they've been working on for a few years, but they just put together a program where they've worked with hospitals to partner. So that way they have multiple hospitals will have a team of sexual assault nurses that are on call to help kind of eliminate that issue from happening. So I'm not sure if that was the issue for being ignored. I can't really think of any other reason why you would be. And still, in that case, they should have been told what hospital to go to, the nearest hospital. But still, I mean, that's not a good situation, regardless.
No, it's not. And someone else was chimed in as well, and so this kind of ties into the therapeutic side of it. But how do you deal with the assault when you blame yourself, which is another element of the trauma that happens? That's very, very common with that. I should have seen it coming, or something along those lines, anything along those lines. And of course, that's compounded by victim blaming, that you get from other people sometimes. But I don't know who might want to jump in there, like what you do when you're blaming yourself for that.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. One, self-blame is part of trauma. It's a diagnostic criteria for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And self-blame, this is going to sound kind of wild maybe, initially, and this is not long-term, is somewhat productive because it helps someone kind of be like, okay, well, this thing happened. When I did this thing, this bad thing happened. So that means I don't do this thing again. It helps. Like I said, this is super short term, so I'm not saying long term at all. Kind of give people some agency maybe a little bit in the beginning. However, it's not helpful, obviously, long term. I think one thing to do, I mean, therapy, I'm a therapist too, so I'm always gonna advocate. I think every human on the earth could use some therapy. Working with a really competent trauma therapist, like someone who really knows trauma and has studied it and understands evidence-based treatment modalities for trauma is really helpful. And just, focusing on, I think, Charlene, maybe you both said it, that, we have this just world belief that bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people. And I think that often compounds that self-blame. My take on it is things happen to people. We can't always know it. We can't always control it. And that sucks. And I acknowledge that. That's hard. But just kind of knowing that things happen, finding a great trauma therapist. And yeah, that's kind of where I would start with that. Adia and Charlene, I don't know if y'all have anything.
Y'all want to add anything else? No? Okay. Yeah, it's hard to completely answer that because everyone's experience is just going to be so different. And so the way that trauma works, and maybe we'll get to this maybe we'll get to the brain stuff towards the end, like the reactions in the brain to brain, it's not, when we talk about the brain shooting, it's like, okay, part of your brain, literally 30% of your brain stops working. We're not talking about that. Your brain does some really interesting, fascinating, and really messed up stuff when you experience trauma, and everybody's reactions are slightly different. And then everybody's reactions, and Adia, you made a really good point of this, giving yourself that grace and that time, and having oh, if it was good for a week and then do this. And, just an example to highlight that, that I think I've brought up in past, panels we've had, what if, if someone's, assaulted on a date, part of what's going to be linked in the person's brain is the smell of the cologne if a guy was wearing cologne. Well, what if you go to class and somebody sitting next to you in class is wearing the same flipping cologne? It's gonna trigger that, and you don't even aware that that's a thing. You don't even realize that memory is in there, and all of a sudden it happens and you do that, and then you're sitting in class and you're trying to listen to econ or something, and all of a sudden your brain, it dissociate and you're back where you were, where the assault happened. And those types of things are so tricky, and everybody's experience is different. It really is unique. And like I said, I have worked with a handful. Y'all have worked with a lot more than I have. And you really do get that gamut of reactions and how people process. And, some people can't even talk about it. And, the reporting, giving people, I think, Shannon, I think maybe we talked about like 2 sleep cycles, type thing once before, like getting yourself a couple, it takes, your brain sometimes can't even process, you can't even really remember what happened for 48 hours, let alone, go into the police station right after it happened or something. It's really complex. And the layers, and blame is just one of the many, many layers of that experience that is just so challenging and so difficult to deal with. So it's difficult. And then as Luann made a good point, helping victims acknowledge they've done their part, that how strong and difficult it is to do that, and then focusing on the personal recovery. I think that's probably in the context of what happens if the justice system sort of blames or fails you a little bit. All right, so we got a couple more questions in the Q&A. I want to make sure we can get to those. So what should you do when you are assaulted and immediately? Okay, I think that answer was in both aspect of that. So I think we've kind of answered that one a little bit. Another person put in a question, how do you handle family members unwilling to acknowledge that someone in the family has sexually assaulted you? That's obviously a very loaded question. So if someone in the family has assaulted you, your own family, and other family members are, I guess, not validating that, not acknowledging that took place. There's about 20 layers of that one there. I don't know, who wants to maybe address that one a little bit.
I'll try, but that's really difficult. And I think that, my answer is kind of gonna maybe be to go around the actual answer that we might want, but I think therapy for that survivor is going to be key, because the truth of the matter is, like you mentioned, there may be some things that we say here that like you don't want to hear, but there may be circumstances under which a family member, a friend, may not ever acknowledge a survivor's trauma and what happened. And just to add to that, that may be indicative of their own stuff that they're dealing with or they have dealt with. But similar to the criminal justice process, it's, we can't associate our healing with, or our healing can't be dependent on, other people acknowledging our trauma or how the criminal justice process works itself out, things like that. And so that's why I say, therapy for that person, to help deal with their own trauma, but then also to help, maybe navigate some of those relationships, some of those conversations that may need to happen.
So Shannon and Charlene, do you want to kind of piggyback or jump in there a little bit?
I think my thing, I've always thought about family, and this can be really difficult depending on which family member it is, right? And your relationship with them. And I'm someone who's grown up in the South. So my parents are like Southern. So, so that whole blood is thicker than water kind of mentality, right? And I've learned, and something I would always say to clients is, I don't believe that sharing DNA obligates you to people. And so sometimes, and this goes right with what Adia was saying, this is typically done working with a therapist, but thinking about who is this family member, how involved are they in my life, and in what way can I somehow figure out how to interact with them that's the least harmful to me. So that may be limiting, that may be figuring out your own way of coping if you've got to be around them a lot, because it may be someone you don't have a lot of a choice. And it may be cutting people off, which is really hard and sounds awful. And I think particularly depending culturally where you're at, maybe like, oh my gosh, we don't do that. And I just don't believe that. I think family doesn't always mean that people we're related to by DNA or by shared genes. So figuring out, well, who's my support system? I think Charlene, you talked about, you talk to your client, the folks you work with about who's your support system. It's like, who else do you have in your life that you can look to and lean on, that's not this person that's being harmful.
I think it's a good point in terms of the aspect of you mentioned something I remember learning and hearing in grad school, and I remember hearing it and going, oh, what a type of comment. You can love someone and still kick them out of your life. And so, and I remember, and it was in, there are times, it's not ideal, I mean, you know, in any way, shape or form, but I mean, you can imagine if you've got a first degree relative who was an offender, who was a perpetrator type of thing, like being in the presence of that person, we're talking about somebody's cologne triggering you, being in the same presence of the person, you know, type of thing, like, oh my heavens, you know. And by the way, can I also take a step back and say, if that, whoever asked that question, if that happened to you, I'm sorry that happened to you, because those types of things are just not things that should happen. And, you know, Shannon, that's also gets at what you talked about, Shannon, before, like the just world beliefs. You know, we talk about that, you know, with, you know, social psychology and cognitive distortions and elements like that, you know, and it's like, that's just, put it this way, you don't have to be a counselor or work in this area very long before you lose that one. That's one that goes out the window pretty quick, you know, with regards, because you find some really incredible people who have had some incredibly horrible things happen to them. And you really don't have to look far in life, but in particularly the areas of sexual assault and various other things. Yeah, somebody was asking asking if this is recorded. Yes, this has been recorded. So I did hit the record button. I did remember to do that. I couldn't remember my thought earlier, but I did do that at the very beginning. So, yeah. Let's see, make sure we're answering. Okay, so we've answered those questions. Does anybody have any other questions? That nobody else has typed anything else in there. So yeah, I know somebody was mentioning that. Yeah, I remember who that was. So we didn't get a chance to. We got a couple more minutes left before we say goodbye. Yay, we get to the nerdy stuff at the end. So I know me and Shannon with the brain. So maybe we could talk. Do you want to address a little bit about like what's going on with the brain? You know, what's happening in 5 minutes? You get 5 minutes to explain what happens to someone's brain during trauma. Go. No, that's.
You want me to do that?
I'm kidding. I'm just playing. 5 minutes.
I mean, I could probably do a super brief, but
you could do we could do a lecture series over the course of 3 years on this topic. So yeah,
I mean,
yeah. But go ahead and help people maybe get a little bit of an understanding. So we talked about the complexities of this. Maybe talk a little bit about like what's going on with that as well.
I mean, when people have crappy things happen to them, and y'all, this can include even like things like discrimination, racism, like stuff that's like has cumulative effects. So it doesn't have to be just a huge thing. But during those things or that thing, and then after, we are doing our brain's bidding. Our brain is just set up to keep us alive. It's also set up to be efficient. And so we're holding memories in our amygdala. Our hippocampus is offline. Our prefrontal cortex is offline. So short-term memory storage, like sequence, time, date, logic, all that. And so when you talked about triggers, Drew, that's what happens, right? When there's those things in the environment that get called up, the amygdala is like, I smell that cologne, that equals threat, right? And so we continue to kind of just do our brain's bidding. And I think that's where a lot of the victim blaming comes in. I hear people making lots of judgments of people because they're doing like, I can't believe they're going out and partying, or they're drinking so much, or they're still, and I'm like, they're literally doing their brain's bidding because they're in this state. They're kind of in this emergency management state, just almost constantly, almost chronically, just depending on what's going on. I don't know. It's hard for me to do it. I'm used to getting 2 hours to talk about the brain.
I know. I kind of shortchanged you on that one.
It's hard to do a little one, but yeah.
Another thing that I would like to add, just from my own experience with the kind of the studying a little bit, it also with PTSD, for example, it's something that compounds over time. And so, like, another way that I teach it to my students is that a lot of times, so if you have a bad day yesterday, so Shannon, you mentioned like it's been a bad week, right? It's like tomorrow's Friday, you get to the weekend, next week, you know, right now you're like, oh, it's been a bad week. Next week you'll kind of be like, oh man, it was a bad week last week. In a month or a year, you'll be like, man, that was a bad week. You know, your reaction, you process things over time. And traumas a lot of times don't get processed the same way normal memories do. And so what's loaded in there is the cortisol and the epinephrine and all the other different hormones and stuff that goes on, and it doesn't get processed the same way. And one analogy, for lack of a better way of putting it in the time we have left, is kind of like a clogged drain. It kind of backs things up. And that backup, if you ever had a clogged sink or something, over time, that stuff backs up and backs up and backs up. And that's kind of one of the things that can happen with trauma, is that when because it's not processed, it can kind of create a messed up system overall. And that impacts how you feel about stuff, and that can get worse. And that's where you see people who have had PTSD for years and years and years. They just, it kind of keeps getting worse and worse and worse in those symptoms. And that's where therapy comes in. And it's really, really important to being able to process and work through that, because that is not simple. It's not a simple, it's not a, oh, I talked about it, I did a police report, thank goodness, oh, I feel better. No, that's no, the levels of it, especially with the things that we've talked about with regards to, you know, the blaming, and what if it's a family member, somebody, you know, how you know, the other aspect of victim blaming, and it just, there's all the different components. It's really, really complicated. So yeah, it's a lot. So yeah, I totally needed to give you more than like 5 minutes to be able to answer that question, and I totally didn't do that justice on there, so I apologize. But as far as I can see, we have answered all of our questions. I kind of thought we'd have a couple more, honestly. I figured, but y'all, I think the reality is y'all have done such an amazing job of answering the questions and being very, very thorough. As I've, you know, Charlene, this is the first time I've had you in this. You've done an amazing job. Idea and Shannon, again, knocked it out of the park. I mean, really excellent answers, very, very good, very difficult questions. Just thank y'all so much for your time and energy with this. And I learned something every time. So, but it is 4:30, so I do want to thank everybody for attending. And just thank you for joining us. So you guys everybody is good to go if you want to. It is going to be recorded, so I will be sending this out to the SBS folks, so you can definitely go ahead and watch recording if you want to be able to do that later on. But yes, thank y'all so much for all of your hard work and your participation, and we'll do it again next year sometime. So thank y'all again. All right, bye everybody. And so I tell you what, right before I do this, I'm gonna go ahead and do, as everyone's leaving, I'm gonna go ahead and put the screen share up with the resources. I had it up over here on this. I've got a dual monitor. I had it over here. I want to make sure we do that. So, but I'm going to go ahead and end the recording. And so if anybody has any questions, you know, I'll stick around for an extra minute or so, but y'all have a great rest of your day. So let's see if I can cancel. Hang on. Oh, I had a couple of thank yous in the Q&A. All right.